Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today we have a case out of California, so let's just get into it, shall we? And first, we're going to start with the parents. Susan met Jeff Markowitz in 1982 in a San Fernando bar. The connection was instant, and they soon became a couple. When they found out they were pregnant after a year of dating, the two decided to move in together. And then on September 19th, 1984, Nicholas Samuel Markowitz was born. Jeff already had two children that he saw on the weekends from a previous marriage. And deciding that they needed more space for this growing family, they bought a house and, at the behest of Jeff's mother, got married on December 7th, 1984, at the local courthouse. While this case is about Nick, there's no explaining what happened without talking about the other people within this. First, like I said, Jeff had two children from a previous marriage, Ben and Leah. Ben was 6 when Nick was born, and Ben unfortunately is going to be the main character for a while I talk. After all, Nick was a bystander for most of the events and simply walks into the wrong situation at the wrong time. So, let's talk about Ben and how he affected his family. According to Susan, she attempted to show all the children that they were equally loved when they were in the home. Ben and Leah lived part-time with their mother, and as I stated, that Jeff had them on the weekends. But as time progressed, parenting time shifted, and eventually Ben and Leah were a 50-50 split between the houses. But Ben had a temper and started rebelling at a young age. By age 11, he and a friend were puncturing tires when they were caught by an off-duty cop who happened to be jogging past them. Teachers filed complaints of misbehaviors. One time, Ben and his mother were arguing, and Ben attempted to leave, but a friend of Leia's, who was 16 at the time, was in the way. Instead of stopping, Ben simply tried to push through him, getting beaten up for his effort, something his mother didn't stop. Another time, Ben and a friend headed to a third friend's house, and after knocking and getting no answer, they simply went in and found keys to a car. So, they took it and proceeded to take the car out for a joyride. He, of course, crashed it. After that, he was sent to a psychiatrist and given Ritalin. Still, it didn't help the behaviors. Still, at the age of 11, Ben wanted to see an R-rated movie while on his mom's week. She said no and stood in the doorway. They got into a physical altercation where Ben was hit with a telephone, and when he restrained her, she bit him. He ran, and Jeff went and picked him up, and for a while from that point on, he stayed full-time with his father and Susan. They tried counseling even more to help. But a few months later, after he came to their home with a broken arm, he told his parents he fell off a bike, when in reality he had been jumped into a gang. The then 12-year-old asked to go to the movies with friends, and Jeff dutifully dropped him off. Afterwards, they found out he skipped the movies, stole a car, partied, and drove to Palm Springs, a 3-hour drive from the family home. He made his way back and was headed to a friend's when Jeff called his brothers and father, going to the address that they knew he was going to go to. As they attempted to stop Ben, he went to take off and slammed into another car. After that, he headed to juvenile detention. And he came home after a while, and the family gave him another chance. He was enrolled in Taekwondo, but at 13, he brought home a gun. Jeff and Susan started implementing room checks, and again at 14, Susan found a clip in his room. After that, Ben stayed with Jeff's dad for a time before his Taekwondo instructor actually offered to house him and train him for a while and try to get him on the straight and narrow. For months, he stayed there, and there was no notifications of Ben getting into any trouble at this time. So the family really thought it was working and decided, after spending thousands, it was time to bring him back home. Within a short time, however, tempers were up again. Ben wanted to go out with friends, but he and Jeff were in the middle of a conversion of the garage into a brand new room just for Ben, and told him he had to paint it before he left. Ben and Jeff ended up in a wrestling match, and the next day Jeff said he could either follow the rules or get out. Ben immediately left, checking in every now and again, just to basically let them know he was still alive and doing fine. 6 months later, he did return home, and he was covered in tattoos. He got kicked out of high school and was sent to a different school where he was jumped into a new gang. Within a few months, he was kicked out of this high school too for trying to incite a gang war. The then 16-year-old was out of with friends when he beat up a guy with brass knuckles. Days later, while riding in another stolen car, he was found by police and ended up with 2 charges: grand theft auto and assault with a deadly weapon. He, s- he stayed in detention camp until February 25th, 1995, when he was released home. By 1997, Ben, of course, was gone again. The family told him he couldn't have pit bull puppies that he tried to bring home. At Nick's bar mitzvah, Ben had been drinking and asked Jeff if he could drive Nick home for the after party. Jeff didn't see it, and so he originally said yes, but Susan had seen his drinking and said he couldn't go. Jeff agreed after finding out he was drinking, and naturally, that made Ben mad, and he took off in a huff, arriving to the home later that evening just to stand on the lawn and scream obscenities, particularly at Susan. Leah went off to college, coming home to work at Disney Studios, meeting Ian. In July 1999, they went to Vegas and got married with the family present. Ben, of course, was late. But Ben began to argue, first with Leah and then Jeff, in the middle of her wedding reception over some money that he supposed that he should be owed. And Leah ended up having to kick her out of her own wedding. Okay, so that is a lot about Ben and not much about Nick so far. Up to this point, Nick, like I said, was kind of a background character in the family, and I know that sounds mean. I'm sure the house was a struggle. Uh, I have multiple children, and this episode hits in for many reasons. One is having a son that has some behavioral tendencies, seeing how it affects the other children, trying to balance time with them and not focusing on just him. But time never ends up equal. Susan writes about Nick and how he was a happy go lucky kind of kid, but he does end up transitioning into a teenager that has his own struggles. He struggles with identity and wanting to be with his brother Ben more, something that Susan admitted that she kept him from in an effort to try and keep him safe. All of the children experiment with drugs at some point in their lives. Leah seems to just have an adolescent phase, then becomes an average adult. Ben, as he grows old, starts dealing drugs, racking up debts with dealers around town. Nick wants to be more independent. He experiments on his own and gets into arguments with his parents. He goes out and parties and comes home smelling like cigarettes. Nick failed a class in high school and had to take a summer class to make up for it. Then one time after an argument, Nick took off. Ben ended up calling his parents to say he had Nick. So while Ben was getting into trouble, he actually sort of took care of his little brother. But in a weird sense, he was also doing things with his brother that he shouldn't be. Now let's talk about another character, Jesse James Hollywood. Yes, that is his real name. Jesse had known Ben since he was little. While Ben was a couple years older, they knew each other from baseball, and when Ben turned 20, he started kind of hanging out with Jesse and his group. See, Jesse's father, Jack Hollywood, was a large-scale drug dealer at the time. Jesse was under his father's wing, but a drug dealer nonetheless. In the group, there was also a man named Ryan Hoyt, a guy who would always end up in the debt of Jesse, Casey Sheehan, and a couple others. Ben decided, since he had basically run up a debt with every other drug dealer in town, that he needed to align with Jesse. But things kind of go wrong when Ben said he'd pick up a debt for someone else, one of his friends, in order to alleviate things with Jesse by selling some ecstasy pills that Jesse and Ben got in a drug deal. However, after finding out that the pills were no good, Ben said he wasn't selling anymore and gave the $600 that he had to Jesse. Jesse said he was still short. He owed $1,200. Ben basically told him to fuck off, though the two seemed to remain friendly for a while. Ben decided to try and get his life right around the same time this was happening and saw less and less of Jesse as he was working with Jeff. He even proposed to his girlfriend, who worked as a waitress. One evening, Jesse and his girl went to a restaurant, and when it came time to pay for the bill, he stiffed the $50 and wrote, "Take this off Ben's debt." Ben was angry and called Jesse and left a scathing voicemail on his answering machine. The next day, he called the insurance company, letting them know that the Honda Jesse had reported stolen months prior had been brought to a chop shop by Jesse and partsed out before he called in the insurance scam. Jesse was angry now, too. He had people sit outside Ben's house, so Ben moved. He ended up breaking up with his fiancée at this point and moving in with a friend, even buying a gun. Jesse came home to one of his two dogs dead, and while neighbors reported that they hadn't seen anyone coming or going, he chalked it up to Ben. Then Ben and a friend broke Jesse's front windows with aluminum tubing. Jesse realized it was time to move, so he packed things up, and on August 6, 2000, he called a friend to do some partying before he moved. Meanwhile, the day before, Leah was over at Jeff and Susan's with her daughter. Nick came home early, and the family soon realized that he was high. After an argument ensued, he took off until the evening, returned home that night, and on August 6th, the next morning, Susan actually had to wake him up and ask for a number that a neighbor needed, then went to the kitchen to make omelets. Between 9:30 and 11 a.m., Nick just upped and left. At first, Susan was mad, but as time ticked on, she began to worry. She cleaned his room, took a nap, and still no Nick. Just before 1 p.m., Pauline Mahoney saw a van pull up next to a boy walking down the road. It stopped and men got out, beating this boy before dragging him into the van and taking off, momentarily leaving behind one of the men in the group. She got the license plate number and had her sons help her recite it all the way home. There, she called 911 and reported what she had just witnessed. Moments later, a second call came in from Rosalia de la Cruz, a UCLA student reporting to have witnessed pretty much the same event. But each call was coded incorrectly. One was an assault, and the officers who got that report didn't take it seriously. They went to the scene, and when they couldn't find anyone, basically gave up and went on with their day. They didn't even bother to write up a report. Another officer called Mahoney back, looked up the van that was registered to John Roberts, misread the address, and then didn't take it any further after that. The second call went out as, quote, "for information only," quote, meaning it was only sent out once, and this happened to be at the same time that the officer was talking to Mahoney, so he actually never heard the information. Susan started paging Nick to call her back, but all of her pages were left unanswered. What happened and how did Nick get snatched? Well, on the 6th, Jesse Hollywood, Jesse Ruggs, and William Skidmore were driving around in the van they borrowed from, again, this man named John, Jesse's father's friend, looking for Ben, actually. But as they were looking for Ben, they happened to see Nick walking down the road. They recognized him as they'd hung out with him before, along with Ben. They pulled up and asked Nick where Ben was. He said he didn't know, which was the truth, and so they beat him and threw him in the van. Once in the van, Jesse threatened Nick, and they all smoked weed together. But now they needed to decide what they were going to do with Nick. They drove to a friend of Jesse Ruggs, Richard Hofflinger, and asked to stay. He said yes without even asking questions, and Nick was brought to a bedroom where he had his wrists and legs duct taped and a sock taped over his eyes, along with one of his own socks stuffed into his mouth. Richard and a couple women were getting ready to go out for the evening, and one of them stumbled in the room to see Nick bound. But they were told that he was leveraged to get Ben to pay the debt he owed, and they'd all be gone soon. And pretty much all stated they believed Jesse had a gun, seeing something in his waistband. They knew who he was, so they decided not to get involved. Eventually, two of the men made excuses to go home, and Nick ended up being left in the hands of Jesse Ruggs and decided to take him back home to his own house for the night. The next day, back at the Markowitz home, Susan was calling everyone to see if they'd seen Nick. Then Ben came over. He was in Arizona working and had just gotten back into town. He had no idea what was happening. He was brought up to speed on Nick's disappearing and started making calls of his own. One of them was actually to Jesse James, Hollywood, getting his answering machine and asking if he'd seen him. Susan then set on making missing persons flyers. Jesse woke up and went to see his lawyer that morning, Stephen Hogue. Stephen urged Jesse to let Nick go, and soon as Jesse left his office, he called Jesse's parents, Jack and Lori, telling them Jesse had gotten into something and he'd rather not discuss it over the phone. The two had been out of town, and upon hearing this, immediately returned. Jesse Rugg and Nick were still at Jesse's father's, and so he invited friends over to party. Jesse played Nick off as a friend from LA, but made him vacuum the living room and told people at the house that Nick wasn't to use their phones. Eventually, when Jesse wasn't paying attention, Nick told 17-year-old Graham Presley what had really happened. Graham relayed the story to 17-year-old Natasha Adams and 16-year-old Kelly Carpenter, who were also at the house. The girls asked Nick why he didn't just leave, and it sounds like Nick thought he was actually keeping Ben safe at this point by simply not fighting and staying put. The group together then went to Natasha's house, and she did notice that he had cuts and bruises from the previous day. She ended up helping Nick clean his wounds at her house. Jesse Rugg ended up leaving for a while at this time and essentially told the teenagers not to mess up what Jesse Hollywood was doing, and since everybody seems to be afraid of this Hollywood, they continue to hang out with Nick and not say anything. Jesse Rugg went to lunch with Hollywood to figure out what they were going to do moving forward. Again, while everyone was away, one of the girls asked Nick why he didn't just go, and Nick continued saying he didn't want to make any trouble for his brother. Still, they hadn't made a decision, and so Nick spent another night at Jesse Rugg's house. That night, Natasha called her mother, an attorney, for advice. While her mother advised she go to the police, Natasha was really worried about the wrath of Jesse Hollywood and decided that she was going to get some more information. So the next morning, the group met up again, and Natasha, well, she wanted answers. She asked what was going to happen to him, and eventually Jesse Rugg promised that he was going to be released soon. Though Jesse Hollywood had just offered Jesse Rugg money for him to kill Nick. After that, Jesse Rugg rented a hotel and brought Nick along for a party. That night, Jesse Hollywood told Ryan Hoyt he had a way for Ryan to erase his debt. All he had to do was kill Nick. Jesse gave Ryan a bag with tape and a Tech-9 pistol with a trigger shaved down, converting it from a semi-automatic to fully automatic pistol. Ryan went and picked up Graham Presley, and the two went to the woods and dug a hole in the mountains of Santa Barbara near a trail called Lizard's Mouth. While that happened, Jesse was setting his alibi by picking up a cashier's check at the bank, dropping off his Mercedes at a shop, and going out to dinner with friends. At 11 p.m., Ryan went to the hotel and collected Nick. Nick, Ryan, Graham, and Jesse all took off, heading towards the mountains. Nick was then walked to the path towards the hole. Graham reportedly couldn't go and stayed in the car, supposedly crying the entire time. As they walked, they actually passed 3 other people, but nothing looked amiss, and Nick was walking on his own accord at this point. When they reached the hole, Jesse duct taped him. Then Ryan dragged him to the hole, and Nick was shoved into it. When he was in the hole, Ryan pulled the trigger on the Tech 9 and put 9 bullets into Nick's face and torso. Nick died quickly, and Ryan shoved the gun under Nick's leg before the two covered Nick with dirt. 3 days later, on August 12th, 3 hikers were walking when they noticed a scent, one that is unmistakably of death. As they moved toward it, someone spotted blue jeans sticking out of the dirt, and so one of the hikers, 27-year-old Darla Gasik, guarded the area in an attempt to keep it from being disturbed further, while the other 2 went in search for help. They found a local film crew that had a cell phone and ended up calling police. When Natasha Adams read the news the next day that a body had been found, she immediately confronted her friends. Then, after ensuring she would be immune from prosecution, she went to the police. She was the second female to make a report of those who had murdered Nick Markowitz. Ryan had been bragging, so the group he was close to all knew, along with their girlfriends. By August 16th, police made arrests, that of William Skidmore, Jesse Rugg, and Graham Presley, but Jesse Hollywood was unable to be found. At 2 a.m. on the 17th, Ryan Hoyt and Casey Sheehan were arrested, though Casey was later released. It didn't take long to obtain confessions from all of the men involved and what role that they had to play specifically in Nick's murder. Still, Jesse Hollywood was on the lam. Jesse had cashed out his bank accounts and collected on all those who owed him money the day that Nick was killed. After that, he went to Las Vegas, but after a night, he decided to move on to Colorado. From Colorado, he went back to Vegas, but changed his mind and went home, attempting to stay with John Roberts, who declined, and so purportedly he stayed in a trailer for 10 days before going to Seattle, then was eventually smuggled into Canada. On October 23rd, 2000, a grand jury trial started for the 3 men in custody and Jesse Hollywood, even though he wasn't there. In the end, all 4 men were indicted, and Ryan Hoyt was the first to go to trial for the murder of Nick, being convicted of first-degree murder on November 21st, 2001. At sentencing, he was given death. Jesse Rugg was up next, and thanks to having his confession deemed inadmissible, was acquitted on the murder charges, but found guilty of only kidnapping in April 2002, for which he was sentenced to life in prison with the ability to parole after 5 years. In July 2002, Graham was up next, and for his first trial, it ended up in a mistrial. In October 2002, the second jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced as a juvenile, so as to remain in custody until the age of 25. Jesse Hollywood moved around Canada for 6 months. He went to places such as Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, and Quebec. In Quebec, he bought a fake passport and a 5-year visa to Brazil, traveling first to Mexico and then on to Brazil in 2001. There, he took on the name Michael Costa Giro. Jesse met a woman named Marcia, a 35-year-old. You see, he had heard that Brazil won't extradite those who have children born in the country after he read about a train robber who fled the U.S. many, many years before this. Jesse quickly got Marcia pregnant. And as the years went on, he did get lazy. And when he got notified a cousin was coming to visit in Saquarema, he agreed to meet her at the airport. As he went to hug her, he was put in handcuffs, and Interpol had him. On March 7, 2005, Jesse Hollywood was taken into custody and returned to the U.S. the next day. At the same time, his 55-year-old father was arrested for manufacturing the date rape drug GHB. Jack Hollywood was a known drug dealer again who managed to send his son money monthly, even while he was on the FBI's most wanted list. Jesse, once arrested, did report that he had a child on the way, but it simply didn't matter. You see, Jesse was in the country under a fake passport, making him an illegal citizen, so they didn't have to think about extradition being an issue. They were simply deporting an illegal immigrant. Since it was deportation, Jesse couldn't be cuffed for the plane. Instead, agents bound him with rope and covered his arms so others couldn't see. Then they actually used the elevator for carts to move him without press seeing and arrested him when he got off the plane in California. He was read his rights at the station and placed in solitary confinement at the Santa Barbara County Jail. In May 2009, Jesse's trial finally started. No surprise here, but he was found guilty of first-degree murder and simple kidnapping. During sentencing, the jury recommended life in prison, though death was an option. And on February 5th, 2010, the judge agreed with the jury recommendations. And with that, Jesse James Hollywood was sentenced to life in prison. And if this case sounds familiar, it was the inspiration for the movie Alpha Dog. They did speak to Susan before making the movie. And with that, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.